Now, joining us for a discussion on mineral security policies for worst-case scenarios, please welcome Senior Vice President Operations North America at Teck Resources, Gill. Chief Executive Officer and Director at Standard Lithium, David Park. Senior Advisor at EMR Capital, Josh Parrill. And Deputy Assistant Secretary for National Battery Strategy, DOE Office of Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation, Madeleine Bugel. Moderated by partner at DLA Piper, Oliver Wright.
It's bright.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I'm Oliver Wright. I'm a partner at DLA, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this session. So DLA is proud to have a close working relationship with SAFE and to again sponsor the summit this year. And this panel, Mineral Security Policies for the Worst Case Scenarios, is designed to stress test the current momentum on mineral security against long-term challenges, really the kinds of challenges we're seeing today, such as prolonged commodity price collapses, capital flight, sustained logistics choke points, and strategic manipulation by dominant producers. So I think we're gathering at an inflection point. The US has taken significant strides over the past year. In February, the State Department hosted the Critical Minerals Ministerial, where the US signed several new bilateral critical minerals frameworks and MOUs with countries around the world. Secretary Rubio announced the creation of Forge. The USTR has launched critical minerals action plans with the EU, and there are several federal government financing programs available for the critical minerals sector. So there's no question that the government has come to terms with the importance of this issue. But momentum on the issue is not the same necessarily as building resilience. And so the question for this panel is, are these initiatives that are being implemented today sufficient to meet the worst case scenario? We know that worst case scenario is either upon us or coming. S&P Global predicts a 10 million metric ton shortfall of copper supply by as soon as 2040. JP Morgan is forecasting a significant shortfall as soon as this year. And there are structural challenges well beyond copper for commodities like lithium, rare earths, and other minerals which are critical to energy transition, defense capabilities, and for our economy. So today we need to explore all the tools in the toolbox and to consider whether or not these are sufficient for an even more significant downturn. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. Josh from EMR is a specialist mining private equity investor headquartered in Melbourne. Josh brings the investor view to this panel. Brock from Teck, which is a significant producer of copper and zinc and other commodities globally. David Park, who is the CEO of Standard Lithium, a near-commercial lithium producer developing a project here in the US, and Madeleine Bugel, the Department of Energy's Deputy Assistant Secretary for the National Battery Strategy. So welcome, everybody. And Brock, I might start with the first question for you. Teck's one of the world's major copper producers, and copper is probably the best example of a large volume commodity that is facing significant supply crisis. We know that new copper mines take a long time to build. Can you help us distinguish the differences between a large commodity and the challenges faced for the copper sector as compared to perhaps other more niche, smaller volume minerals such as rare earths or lithium?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. So I think that there isn't a single critical minerals policy. What we have is large-scale volume commodities like copper. This is a scale problem that requires a predictable environment due to high capital intensities and their long lifetimes. On the other hand, we have minerals that are smaller, more niche, or predominantly byproducts. This is a responsiveness problem. The market can't react, or the minerals can't react to changes in the supply very quickly. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to combine what is right now a short-term emergency, if you will, supply side with a development timeline that's measured in years, if not decades. And so I think what this brings us to is, if I step back, I'd frame this as kind of system fragility. What we're trying to do is build resilience into the system as a whole. And I think that there's three layers to this system. The first layer is geology and the supply side. We can't choose where the ore bodies are. However, what we do know is the United States has an incredible resource endowment. When you pair that up with near countries such as Canada, you've got the ability to bring them on. What you have is an acceleration problem. How do we bring these projects online? The second layer that you lead into is around conversion. And so that's how do you take these ores that we're extracting and move them into a secondary state. This is actually the choke point. It's smelting and refining capacity. This is where we're seeing disruption today due to high concentration of the market. And the third layer that sits underneath this is latency. It's system response. It's our execution risk. This is when we get into permitting timelines. It's when we get into policy through the cycle, and this is where capital comes into play. And so what we're trying, again, to resolve is the short-term security with long development timelines. So as an operator, Teck has assets in Alaska that we're trying to expand. Predictability is the critical variable. Capital will come, but only with confidence in permitting timelines and visibility into demand. Second, policy needs to focus on system design, specifically in the smelting and refining markets that I mentioned. And lastly, the role of government is to reduce risk, not necessarily to manage the market. And I think this is, again, it's permitting, which I've mentioned, it's long-term signals, and it's enabling infrastructure, such as power, roads, and actually labor and training. So resilience isn't necessarily self-sufficiency. It's actually the ability of the system to absorb a shock and not fail. Right now, it's exciting as we're in this window where we have higher prices, where we have government focus, and we have a view of what the risk of disruption is.
Thanks, Brock. I mean, in some ways, when you talk about the sort of strategy and the government needs to implement, in many ways, I guess, as a large company, you're implementing similar strategies to manage your own risk. Do you sort of see that there are learnings the government can take from the way a large corporate like Teck manages its portfolio risk?
I think there are some similarities. I mean, both are dealing with like longer time frames, especially within some of the ministries, and then with respect to mining companies, we're also dealing with these multi-decade sort of life cycles because they're so capital intense. And so I think the learning, and maybe it's a learning that goes both ways, is how do you have policy, it was actually mentioned this morning, that kind of continues through both cycles.
Thanks. And David, I might turn to you, and there's a clear distinction, obviously, between a company like Teck with a large portfolio operating in sectors like the copper commodity sector. Standard Lithium's developing a single, although very significant, domestic lithium project in the US and will implement new technologies. Can you contrast a little bit the types of challenges that a company like Standard Lithium faces, and how does government policy impact your ability to develop?
Sure. First, I'll say Standard Lithium is, as a pre-revenue junior miner that is operating with a novel technology in a world-class resort, on a world-class resource, is a much more concentrated bet for investors and for policymakers, and it's very levered to the right decisions being made. So we don't have a portfolio to rely upon. Standard has been working for over 6 years to de-risk our technology. We were a first mover in the Smackover Basin. We believe we've secured the best land position in just a fantastic reservoir that's globally significant for lithium in terms of size and quality. We have a world-class energy major as a partner, and we are surrounded by other energy majors with neighboring properties. And what I'll say is, if we get this right, there's the opportunity to open up in an entire region and be for lithium and American energy dominance what fracking was for oil and gas. So highly levered to the right policy decisions and choices. Arkansas has been a fantastic place to do business. The governor gets it. Her cabinet gets it. They have an established royalty regime, an established brine production regulatory regime in place. So the property rights regime is well understood and stable. We spent a couple of years getting the royalty regime established in Wright in a manner that worked for Arkansans as well as for developers, and we have that now. Her administration is also very active at trying to attract midstream and downstream customers to Arkansas as well. So they get it, they're supportive. When I talk to the governor in Arkansas, I tell her, you've done your part, it's time for us to do our part. Similarly, the federal government's been very supportive as well. The Department of Energy has awarded us a $225 million grant. That's very helpful for us to be moving our project forward. We were designated a Fast 41 program by the White House to ensure an efficient and timely regulatory process as we go through the NEPA process. And we're hopeful that that wraps up by the end of the month. So that's pretty close there for us at this point in time. So the efficiency of the regulatory process has been very helpful. And then USXM has been very constructive as well. They've provided us an indication of interest for over $400 million of non-recourse project financing, and we're working with them and 2 other export credit agencies to put together over $1 billion loan package for our project. So generally, I'd say the national administration has been quite supportive of what we're doing, and the state has as well.
Thanks, David. I think that's a good segue actually into addressing a question to you, Madeleine, because David just talked about a number of government programs that are there to support his project. Can you walk us through the toolkit that the DOE and also the broader federal government has at its disposal and that it is rolling out now to address critical minerals concerns?
That's a great question, Oliver. First of all, I'm so happy to be here along with these co-panelists on behalf of the Department of Energy's newly minted Office of Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation. From a broad perspective, CMEI is prioritizing the energy and manufacturing needs of our country, including transportation, energy, and defense, while strengthening our national security and supply chains. Other offices within DOE and across the government focus on foundational science, geological exploration, and early-stage technology development. CMEI's mission is to translate these advancements into strategic visions that are tangible, scalable, commercial, and de-risked. I hope that David can help speak to some of the experience working with our office, but CMEI's expertise runs the gamut of critical minerals and materials. So that's lithium, rare earths, copper, electrical steel, aluminum. The list goes on, and we're trying to give individual attention to every single critical mineral and material here. Everything will need an individualized approach that we are monitoring closely and working to marry up the right functions to each supply chain. We're working on commercializing domestic critical minerals and materials production that underpins the battery critical mineral supply chain, in particular, driving innovation, working with R&D, our national labs, alternative chemistries to really hit that national security and supply chain resilience that we need. Another major strategy is to look at everything individually and the entire supply chain. So to Brock's earlier point, the smelting, the midstream, that in every single critical mineral and material is something that we are looking at so closely. The smelting capacity in this country is so important to the mission of our office. So, the supply chains might be different, but the ever-growing demand is the same. And we are very excited to work with speed, but also in a very precise way, and to be good partners to move forward our energy security.
Thanks, Madeleine. I mean, I think you kind of highlight the enormity of the challenge and the number of different efforts that are needed to sort of tackle this. I guess, Josh, I might turn to you. I mean, we're hearing a lot about the efforts that are underway to support the critical mineral sector and how important critical minerals are to the world economy. But from an investor's perspective, what's keeping investors out of the sector? I mean, if everything was so good and being supported so robustly, surely everyone would be pouring their money in. So what is it that actually, what are the challenges that you see that are keeping money out of the sector, and what can be done about those challenges?
Yeah, really good question, and hi everyone, nice to see you. As a long-term mining investor, I think this is a really good question. And historically, I think the best way to think about it is that investors are efficient. And so when they look at the mining sector on a whole, they're seeing extreme volatility. Commodity price volatility, risk around country risk and safety of individuals, you name it, the industry historically has been fraught with those risks. And so an efficient investor would look at that and say, okay, I could go here and maybe for a window of time I can get an outperforming IRR, but over the next 5 years after that, it may go down. If you see those charts that sort of show performance by sector by year, you'll see gold or commodities at the top one year and then at the bottom the next year. And that volatility, I think, is really hard for institutional investors to digest. As I've sort of been around SAFE this year in particular, it's become clear to me that private equity groups are the groups that need to take the lead on this. And the reason for that is that they're the experts. So, individual retail investors, okay, may do something. The big banks tend to just be sponsoring deals and raising capital, not necessarily deploying it themselves. So these private equity groups, like EMR and many others, need to take the lead and be the expert investor in the room. And in order for those groups to be successful, they need to raise funds from their investors. And those investors want fair weather or all-weather performance. They want they want the SUV of the investment industry, right? That whether the market's going up or down, you can make money. Of course, there will be some volatility, there will be some challenges, but they want to be able to deploy capital on a consistent basis, 10-year over or 5-year over 5-year over 5-year period to make that work. So that's sort of the lay of the land. So when an investor looks at all of those risks historically and they see, geez, the S&P is making 20% this year and it's liquid and I can, go in or go out, I think there have been historically better alternatives. And so that efficient market is maybe, this is what we're talking about, it's not quite working. And so there's obviously a lot of ideas that DOE and other groups are providing around price floors. I've been hearing a lot of that, which would, of course, lessen that volatility and make it more appealing on a long-term basis for investors to come in. So I think that it's a challenging space. It will continue to be a challenging space, and we're not going to engineer that volatility out of it. But as the industry gets more momentum and more broader support, then I think it will attract more investors. And we can sort of build on that and get more and more groups involved, not just the experts, but then the next smart money coming in and suddenly build a base that maybe has existed historically to support the industry, but over the last generation has waned, which brings us to, I think, the point that we probably are at kind of the worst case scenario right now, at least a local minimum, and hopefully up from here.
Thanks. And so, I think what I'm hearing is for investors to come in, we need long-term stability and consistency in the market. Madeleine, I think as part of that, there's a growing consensus that we need supply-side interventions, not just, or that supply-side interventions alone are not sufficient, that we also need demand-side to be propped up. What is the government doing in order to signal that demand, and how does the national battery strategy fit into that demand signaling?
Thank you for the question, Oliver. So that's a great point, and I think me coming into this role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Batteries, we're really working on what that strategy is and how we create that signal for that long-term security. You know, in the battery space in particular, we're so heavy on lithium ions, and that battery supply chain is so dominated by China, you know, not just the upstream, but also the equipment that makes it. And so we want to increase some security there, and moving into alternative chemistries will be a great way to help bolster that security. We're working with, we have a great consortium, the Federal Consortium of Advanced Batteries, that coordinates across the government. This is a whole of government approach. So really coordinates specifically in the battery space to ensure that we are in lockstep and, you know, creating those right signals and making sure that everything where the rubber meets the road is really seamless. Traceability is another initiative that we're working on, because there are so many procurement requirements and, you know, supply chain requirements. But if you don't have the traceability to really be able to prove out those supply chains, then, you know, it's tough for it to really make an impact. So we're working very closely on that. And I think the president, through so many executive orders focused on our critical mineral security, energy security, has really sent a very, very strong signal on our commitment to the security of these supply chains.
Thank you. Brock, I might turn to you, because we're talking about the need for long-term stability, but in recent years we've seen some very short-term shocks to the market. Teck, as well as producing copper and zinc, it produces byproducts like gallium and germanium, which have probably faced some of the most significant shocks through export bans from China. When you look back at that moment, what is the takeaway? How did Teck deal with those sorts of issues? And with hindsight, what could the government have done prior to those shocks coming to fruition, done to prevent or to change the path of those sorts of circumstances arising?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. I might pick on kind of or pull on one of the threads that Madeleine mentioned around speed, and Josh around kind of investment horizons, and then work that backwards. And so if we were to have a disruption today, you know, what's the through line and what remains the same? And I would say that on the first hand, we have projects that are in need of acceleration to be able to supply that gap. Secondly, we still have low inventories of refined metals. And lastly, it's this comment that's already been mentioned around smelting and refining capacity and how there's not much on shore. So that, I would say, is that through line that remains more or less the same. That's the system reality. That's the fragility that's kind of buried in our current system. And to your point, I think germanium is a really good analog or an entry point to be able to unpack this. And so at Teck, we're a large producer of germanium. We sell most of that germanium here into the United States. We're one of the largest suppliers. We've been doing that for decades. And so what hasn't changed is supply. What's changed is how it's come into focus throughout the industry. And germanium is, again, it's interesting because it's not a primary product. It's actually a byproduct. In our case, it's a byproduct of zinc. And what that means is you can't ramp it up independently. The markets are also small. They're concentrated. And that points to a few things around, like, what's the architecture that we can put in place, which I think is the root of this question. And so number one, visibility and engagement matters. Early visibility and engagement, because of long timelines. So in smelting and refining, it's more like 3 years versus mines, but still getting in. If you want to put resiliency into the system, you've got to start it early. Secondly, policy needs to be explicit. The vulnerability in the system sits in the midstream, and that's where we actually have to do a lot of the work. Thirdly, policy needs to move at the speed of the market. And that's probably where we're the shortest at the moment, where supply tightened faster than in which we could react. And this ties back to this broader concept, which was kind of the end of your question, is, you know, what can we do within government to kind of change that narrative? So one, predictable policy frameworks that allows us to get the permitting that's out in front of us. It allows us to work with our communities. We need support for the processing and recovery, and we need demand-side visibility. So you wrap that up, and there's this issue that with things like germanium, you cannot bring them on the market independent of other supply.
Thanks. David, a couple of questions I wanted to direct to you. One, do you think there is enough incentive for upstream explorers, junior companies, to be investing in exploration, or is that a gap that still remains, notwithstanding all of the government interventions that we've been talking about? And I guess more broadly, how do you see the framework that's being put in place at the moment being able to support the lithium sector generally in the event that we see more sustained downturn in prices in the lithium sector?
Sure. I'd say I think the incentives are there for exploration. I don't think much needs to change to incent exploration in the lithium side. The real challenge is when you go to spend the real dollars. When, exploration, takes time, it takes effort, but there is the pool of capital available there in different portions of the capital markets for risky exploration capital. I think the real challenge is when you go to build, particularly when a junior miner or a pre-revenue company says, okay, we want to build something that's $1.5 billion. And not only do we want to build that $1.5 billion project, we want to do another one 2 or 3 years after that, and another one after that. It's the capital to scale and make operational that is the biggest challenge.
And you've obviously seen support from the government to date. What do you think is the next step that's needed from government in order to sort of meet that challenge?
Well, I would think, I don't think government needs to enter into offtake agreements. So I don't think it's that. I think there's plentiful demand for lithium in the 2028 and beyond timeframe that there are lots of customers willing to sign up. The challenge is finding customers willing to sign up for long-term take-or-pay obligations with price floors in them. So what could be helpful would be price floors. That opens up, that makes, if we had price floors in the fall, we'd be constructing right now. We'd be in production. It's clear that the government no longer wants to provide price floors to domestic developers of projects. So then I'd say the next thing is creative sources of capital. Right now, the biggest tool in the box, or the primary tool in the box, is senior secured loans. But I think a number of developers would be open to, and projects would be facilitated if it wasn't just senior secured, but if they were open to unsecured mezzanine type of debt, or whether the government would entertain notes that are convertible into equity of companies. Those sorts of things could be helpful. And then I'd also say credit support for the downstream and the midstream could be helpful. So we all know that China controls over 70% of the lithium chemicals, and they've actively been working to manipulate the markets. There was a House committee, a select committee on China that came with that conclusion last year. There was Section 232 investigation, which I think came to the same conclusions. And so we're trying to build out domestic upstream, and we're also trying to build out domestic midstream and downstream. Some of the projects or companies looking to invest in the midstream are logical customers for the upstream, but they don't have the balance sheets to be helpful to the upstream players when they're looking to put their projects in place. So credit support for Western domestic midstream players buying product from the upstream. That's another potential tool available.
Thanks.
Hey, Oliver, may I just add one more thing on that? And I thought that was really good insights there. Just one other sort of specific policy observation I guess I've made is that there is a lot of credit support for single asset developers. There's not a lot of equity support. And you talked about some synthetic equity and some other. In my experience, equity might be the missing catalyst. And this is interesting because in emerging markets, I feel like there's a lot of US government support for equity. However, in domestic markets, it's non-existent, at least from what I've been able to figure out. The perspective here is that my day job, in addition to EMR Capital, is I'm running a potash development asset in Utah, and the mic is going out. Anyway, I think a policy change that would be helpful would be to add equity support or equity-like support for single asset developers to go alongside those, say, industry private equity experts that we touched on earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So making sure that the entire capital stack for different stages of development, different parts of the supply chain is all being met. It's interesting you just mentioned the distinction between tools available for projects domestically as opposed to projects internationally. And whether by accident or by design, you sort of see that there's maybe some gaps for domestic projects more than international projects. I guess looking at those international projects, because EMR invests globally, including places like Zambia, do you see that the tools that are being put in place by the US government, both in terms of the sort of multilateral or bilateral agreements being reached with other governments, as well as some of the financing tools available, are sufficient to help encourage investment into those international projects, or do you see there's other opportunities there too?
Another question. I think it helps, but there's more that can be done, and probably it's not exactly addressing the risk that most people perceive. In other words, country risk or security of the asset. You know, there's PRI insurance and other things that can be secured to ensure. To ensure that gives some protection to investors. So the bilateral treaties, I think, are sort of maybe paving the way or opening the door for investment in those countries. But again, mining expert investors can do their own diligence on a specific country, get up to speed on what the key risk areas are, can get insurance to protect against some downside outcomes. So I would say it's a nice to have, but it's not sort of blowing the door open to allow others to invest there.
Right, and I think one of the things as a panel we were talking about earlier was the fact that, well, I think everyone commends the efforts of the administration to entering into multiple bilateral arrangements. The enormity of that challenge is pretty significant. I know, David, that was something you were commenting on.
Sure, yeah, I'll say, first I'll say I'm incredibly complimentary and appreciative of the support we've had from the federal government. Then I'll say, when we talk about plurilateral agreements, I wouldn't have done it that way. We identified a problem. We have projects that are shovel ready and ready to go. And now we're looking at striking 55 plus agreements over 35 critical minerals and all the different permutations of those. None of those agreements are going to be meaningful for us in the timeline that's meaningful for us. So, and we're not the only one. I'm just using Standard Lithium as an example. We have well-established system where you have Section 232 investigations, then there's recommendations, and then tariffs are put in place. That would have been a much more efficient, easier answer. But striking, I hope to be proven wrong, but striking these 55 plus deals across all those different commodities is going to take a long time, I suspect.
Right. And I'll sort of, conscious of time, sort of put a question to everyone, but Brock, I'll start with you. I mean, we've talked about a lot of different policies, a lot of different interventions, but if you had to boil it down, what really is the most essential intervention to avoid a sort of worst case disruption in the critical minerals sector? And what do you think governments really need to be focusing on right now?
So I think we have to move at two speeds. On one hand, if you want to apply the right tools, I think that the fastest one we have, speaking specifically to mining, is going to be around brownfields expansions. These are close, these are near a mine, you can mobilize capital quickly. To the point that's being made, you actually have a risk reduction exercise going on, so you can bring in capital much quicker to those areas. So I think that's the first piece of kind of building resiliency in. I think then you flip around, and if you're bimodal, you sit there and say, okay, what's going to happen in the greenfields environment? When you look at a lot of greenfields, they have some commonalities, whether that's in smelting and refining, whether that's in data centers. I heard the conversation this morning. That's enabling infrastructure. It's how do you get power, how do you get water, and how do you deal with community support? And then I think to the comment that's been in here for some of the smaller kind of niche byproducts, you need very good demand visibility and demand signaling when we talked about whether it's price floors or other areas to be able to kind of invest for the long term. So I think you got to move at both of those speeds.
Thanks. And Madeleine, I mean, in response to that, what do you think the DOE and the government's view is of the most sort of critical step at this point?
I mean, the good news is that we have been doing so much over the past year. This is a very, very high priority space, and we've been looking at all of our options, all of our tools, everything's on the table. And collectively, the US government has been supporting projects with over $30 billion of letters of interest, investments, grants, loans, and other support just over the past 6 months, really working in lockstep with the private sector. We have to continue to invest in public, private, and joint innovation technology solutions, really working on the R&D side, de-risking, getting to commercialization, and filling in that gap on the midstream and the downstream. We're working really closely with industry, with our labs, a lot on the technology side to help bridge that gap. And we are continuing to look at every tool in our arsenal because we understand the criticality of this and to continue this momentum going forward.
Thanks. And Josh, I'll turn to you. I mean, as an investor, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of ideas as the group, and I would agree with really all of those. I guess as I think about sort of what's the key missing piece, I would just reiterate that the industry has so much risk already. Layering any more risk is just unappetizing to investors. And so, there's lots of different ways to play that, but sort of to complement maybe what's been said, I think it's the development timeline. I'm sure you all have read, there's a quote or, a study that says it's somewhere between 15 and 20 years from discovery to operation of an asset in the US, and that's just way too long. I mean, even the longest dated family offices or family offices with almost infinite tenors of investment period still don't want to wait that long. And so I think the pieces are in place around the FAST 41 and some of the other permitting, unification, and alignment strategies. So now it's sort of the accountability side of that. Let's see that actually happen. And if we can knock 5 years or 3 years off of a permit process, while the project is still being de-risked because it's necessary, I think that will be a huge boost to the sector. And again, it will build on itself and allow more and more investment into the space.
And in the sort of more recent term, I mean, there obviously have been steps made, as you talked about with FAST 41 and other steps towards speeding up development timelines. Are you seeing that is spurring capital to come in, or do you think we really do need to see more done?
I mean, I don't have sort of evidence to support. Certainly, there's groups out there that are announcing this news, and I think they're getting additional support for that. But my gut feel is we actually need to have it run full circle. So I think there's groups that are out there, I mean, David's among others, that have had that designation. And once you have the permit, then I think we'll be able to say, okay, this is going to get here more quickly.
Exactly.
And David, do you think, as a developer, are you concerned that we'll see the tide turn again? I mean, right now we seem to be in a moment, but perhaps it's with this administration, that there is more support, that there's a willingness to develop these projects quicker. Do you see that we've heard a lot this morning about there being bilateral support for this sector. Do you see that support there, or is there a concern among developers that the tide could turn?
I do see bilateral support. So for lithium in particular, I see bilateral support, and I'm not concerned about that. Where I am concerned is we're doing a lot, and there's great coordination between White House, Department of War, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, DFC, XM, all the way across. We have too few people chasing too many opportunities right now. I don't believe the administration currently or any recent administration understands the level of, fully comprehends the level of commitment China has made in this sector over decades in terms of people and dollars. And we just need to make sure if we're going to do what we're doing, we sustain it, but we have enough people in the government in all those different departments to advance a number of these projects and initiatives.
Thank you. So I guess we're at time, and as we wrap up, I mean, I think it's positive to hear that there's bilateral support, that there are a number of tools in place to address these concerns, but it sounds like there's still more to be done, and we need government to sort of remain committed and to put the resources behind this issue. Thank you very much. Thank you to SAFE for organizing this session.
Thank you very much.